As we sit here today, at this very hour, there are thousands of people across Mexico, mainly women, searching for missing people. People like Rocío de Carmen, who is pictured here with León, Guanajuato behind her. Rocío de Carmen has in her right hand a piece of rebar. It's been fashioned into a T by a welder. And if you could see the end of it, you would see that it's sharp. And this rebar is actually used by people who are part of these searches to prod into the ground in search of clandestine graves. And so what they're searching for really is soft points. And as they find them, they twist, and they pull out the piece of rebar, and they raise it to their nose, and they inhale, because they're searching for death. Now, these collectives used to be the type of thing, these search parties, colectivos de búsqueda, as they're known in Spanish, used to be the type of thing that you only saw in Ciudad Juárez. 20 years ago in Ciudad Juárez, women started going missing. We now refer to these types of deaths in places like Juárez as femicides, or femicidios. And at the time, women, mainly mothers in Ciudad Juárez, started these search parties to look for their missing daughters and mothers and grandmothers. Today, these search parties, these colectivos de búsqueda, exist throughout Mexico. There's thousands of them. In Guanajuato alone, where I was living last fall, there are more than 30 search parties, groups of women who are constantly searching every single week for missing people. The situation in Mexico reflects a humanitarian crisis. Since 2006, when then President Felipe Calderón declared a war on narco-trafficking, more than 450,000 people have been killed. And during the same time period, another 130,000 people have gone missing. They simply can't be found. People like Rocío de Carmen and colectivos de búsqueda around the country estimate that that number is actually 2 to 3 times as high. The thing is the government likes to underreport missing people and homicides because it's not good for business. It's not good for tourism. It's not good for auto manufacturers, one of the biggest industries, for example, in Guanajuato. And so these people have banded together amongst themselves to search for the dead, to search for the missing. Sometimes people are found alive. The vast majority of people are either never found at all or are not found alive. This humanitarian crisis isn't something that just affects Mexico. Of course, there's wars currently in Ukraine, the genocide in southern Sudan, there's climate change, there's insecurity, civil and political rights, and democracy, of course, as we know it, is backsliding, not only in the United States, but around the world. And so the crisis itself is reflective of something that's taking place not just in Mexico, south of our border, but in many other places around the world. It's reflective of a humanitarian crisis that we haven't, at least we could say it doesn't have precedent in recent times. It's not surprising, given this, that in the last few years, millions of people have come to the United States in search of asylum, in search of refuge. And what I'm going to argue tonight is that, unfortunately, most of these people get turned back. And that the erosion of asylum in the United States, right, this breakdown of the U.S. asylum system really reflects something much deeper. That is the erosion of democratic principles and a retreat from the nation's foundational identity as a place of refuge for those in need. Some of the questions I hope to address tonight are questions like, who are the asylum seekers? Where are they coming from? Why are so many coming right now? What are the odds of them winning their asylum cases? And why does any of this matter at all? I want to talk a little bit before I jump into the details about my own perspective. I have spent the better part of 20 years researching issues of migration. I can't explain in a nutshell why that is, but part of it has to do with where I grew up. I grew up in Telluride, Colorado. I was born there. And then rent became too expensive, even in the 80s. And we moved to Norwood. Norwood's a working class town west of Telluride. If anyone knows San Miguel County, it's very divided in terms of politics, right? Telluride and Norwood are not the same place. I was the hippie kid for the first few years when I moved to Norwood. And one of the things that I experienced early on when I started working around the age of 12 or 13 on weekends, washing dishes, or one of my first jobs was actually pulling metal out of recycled wood from old buildings in Seattle that they bring in to build these multi-million-dollar mansions on ski slopes. But it turns out that you need someone to pull that out, otherwise the saw blades apparently are really expensive. So a young man named Miguel and I would spend our weekends, well, he would spend all of his time doing it. And on weekends, I would help him. And we would, use a metal detector and locate the wood, and then they'd have to get in there and pull the wood out, or pull the metal out so they could go through the saw. And it was through people like Miguel that I started to realize just how important immigrants are within the broader picture of the U.S. economy. Right? I, of course, was experiencing this in the microcosms of Southwest Colorado, but it was through his story that I became somewhat fascinated with the lengths that people are willing to go to improve the lives of their loved ones. And so I ended up studying sociology. I ended up researching immigration as a part of my dissertation. And for the better part of the last 15 years, I've been writing about these issues, both in academic spaces as well as the popular press. When we moved to Durango, I started working with local advocacy groups and specifically got involved at law firms, both here and across the country, doing as an expert witness, basically. Expert witnesses, if somebody dies of a heart attack and they suspect that maybe it was an accident, but it seems like there might have been someone in there that poisoned the person, right? They bring in an expert witness to see whether or not that was a possibility, right? In asylum cases, you need expert witnesses to help judges make sense of all the different conditions that people are fleeing. As a judge, it would be impossible to understand the complexities of 150 or 160 countries that people are coming from on any given day. And so that was my first introduction to legal work, working with migrants on their asylum cases. And I also spent some time as the program's called the RNA program, but it's a program that allows you to become registered with the Department of Justice to serve as a legal advocate for migrants applying for asylum or citizenship or residency. And so from 2022 to 2025, I helped out with Compañeros legal service program in that capacity. But I also have a personal experience that weighs in to my thoughts on this issue. From 2016 to 2018, I lived in Nicaragua with my family, with my wife and my kids. My youngest was actually born there. People ask him where he was born, and we'll be in public, and people will go, "Where were you born?" And my daughter will say, "Oh, I was born in Colorado, in Alamosa." And then my son goes next, and he was born in Albuquerque. And then the youngest goes and he says, "I was born in Managua, Nicaragua." And they look at me, especially if my wife's not there, like, whoa. They can't quite understand it or make sense of it. But those were the years we were there. And in 2018, on April 19th, there was an uprising against the government. It was a peaceful uprising. People took to the streets. Hundreds of thousands of people rose up against what has unfortunately become a brutal dictatorship run by a social revolutionary turned dictator, Daniel Ortega. And what most surprised me was how quick the stability of everyday life collapsed. Right? Within a question of days, there were armed barricades around the city. Everything in the supermarkets had disappeared. Right? There were people had raided supermarkets. The peaceful protests mainly remained peaceful, but the government started using paramilitaries to snipe people out of those protests. Within a few months, hundreds had died. And so we witnessed what it looks like when society collapses, when the stability, the things that we have come to recognize as always being there, start to disappear. And that experience was augmented by being connected to so many people from Nicaragua who later fled. some of the folks, there was a flight in March of 2023, and there was a flight out of Nicaragua in which political prisoners were gathered up in the early morning of that March day, and they were placed onto a plane, and they were sent off to duels, and they landed in Washington, and they'd been in prison for the last 2 years in Managua, and so even they couldn't make sense of what was happening, but they were obviously happy to be free. But they showed up to the United States, and officials said, well, we can't receive them. They don't have a legal entryway. And so they get the Nicaraguan government on the phone. Nicaragua says, well, you can't send them back because they're not Nicaraguan. We denationalized them last night while they were in the air. And so some of these individuals actually ended up applying for asylum in the US, others in Spain. And those are the types of experiences that, since leaving Nicaragua, have continued to influence the way I think about this subject. In short, I think you could summarize what I've learned from these experiences is that we have very little control over what happens in the future, even though it may feel as if we have control in the moment. I do want to talk a little bit about the history of asylum before I jump into some of the numbers and trying to answer some of these questions I laid out. Asylum is something that has existed, at least as a concept, for a long time. Long before there were nation states, there were religious spaces that would accept people as a form of sanctuary. Right? We've seen this in the United States, right? People have sought sanctuary, even here close by in Mencos. Rosa was in sanctuary in a small church in Mencos for a number of years. And there are similar people across the nation, right? Religious centers of worship are no longer respected by ICE as they were in the past, and so that isn't happening anymore. But if we go back centuries ago to Western Europe and other parts of the world, places of worship were always places where people could seek sanctuary. In the 20th century, the concept of asylum, as we've come to know it, at least in the United States, starts to emerge. The Russian Revolution, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, all of these things influenced the type of instability that led people to come together after World War II and form the United Nations. And the United Nations Statute on Refugees in 1951 defined asylum as a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. And that's the definition that was brought into the United States, although much later, in 1979, under the Refugee Act of 1979, our act aligns with the UN Convention and the Protocol from 1967, and it created this legal framework through which people could apply for asylum. So although the United States is a country that was founded, albeit through conquest, by religious asylees, people seeking asylum due to religious persecution, even though that is the kind of founding principle of the United States, there wasn't really a way through which people could officially apply for asylum until very late into the 20th century, right? So it's an old concept that has a fairly new legal framework in the United States. Jumping into current trends, there has never been a time in history where so many people from other nations have resided in the United States. And so right now, more than 53 million immigrants live in the United States, and that makes up 16% of the population. The other high mark was 1910, when roughly 14.7% of the nation was made up of immigrants. And this political division that we see now is somewhat predicted, right? In the sense that in the early 20th century, 1910, you have this high mark. And then by 1924, you have the Immigration Act of 1924, which was a very conservative act that really was based on racial quotas, right? Allowed certain people of white descent from Western Europe to come to the United States, and most other people couldn't, including for the better part of 100 years, almost, people from Asia couldn't come at all, right? Because of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was supported under that Immigration Act of 1924, or upheld, I should say. So when we look at the current trends, you can kind of think of us in being in a very historic moment, right? A moment in which, since just 2021, more than 8.3 million people have come. Now, these individuals that have come have entered through a system that is backlogged. Right? So 3.6 million immigration cases are currently pending in the United States. Another 2.1, well, not another, but 2.1 million of those are asylum cases. So we're talking about numbers without precedent. There's two different approaches in which you can apply for asylum. I want to talk about both of them. This gives you a sense of the numbers, the number of asylum applications the last 10 years. And as you'll see, there's affirmative and defensive cases, and they're about equal at this point. But they're quite different. So an affirmative asylum case is asylum that you seek proactively. If you were to come to the US border and knock on the fictitious wall and someone answers, you would approach a border patrol agent and say, I fear for my life in my home country, I'd like to apply for asylum. Communicate that as you best could. But you have a right to ask for that, right? You have a right to ask for asylum. And that would be an affirmative process because you are not in the United States yet. Right? Now, another way is if you came on a tourist visa and you were fearful of going home and within the first 6 months to a year, you applied for asylum, you could do so affirmatively. After more than a year has passed, applying affirmatively isn't possible. And so, as you saw, the majority of cases right now, half of them are affirmative and another half are defensive. And defensive asylum cases are a bit different because not only do you apply through a different organization, right? So affirmative asylum cases are through USCIS, which is one branch of government, and then defensive asylum cases are actually through EOIR, which is through the immigration court system. And so the cases that are affirmative tend to last a lot longer. That is, there's people with affirmative asylum cases that have been open for 8 years, 10 years, 12 years. Whereas defensive cases tend to be quite quick. That is, you might have a decision on your case within 8 months. And the vast majority, as we'll see in a second, of asylum cases end in deportation proceedings. And so if time is what you're looking to buy, you're hoping to apply affirmatively. Right? So different processes. If we add those two together, you get the same trend line, and this is the number of pending cases currently, somewhere just under 2.5 million. Asylum seekers come from all over the world. In recent years, the majority have been coming from Venezuela, from Colombia, from Latin America, but also from countries in other parts of the world as well. You can see China and India on there as well. So there's a wide variety of people applying for asylum in the United States currently. I want to talk a bit about the barriers to asylum. Because like I said, the majority of people do not end up winning their cases. Majority of people are issued deportation proceedings. The first barrier is representation. Now, ironically, in the United States, you can commit mass murder and you will get a public defender. But if your crime is crossing the border without documentation, you are not issued a public defender. You go through court alone. You go it alone. And there's instances of deportation proceedings in which individuals are in detention centers, and you'll see individuals in shackles. You'll see 80 people lined across the room in front of a judge, and it's just a mass trial in which the judge is essentially saying, you can either wait here for 8 to 10 months or a year or two, and we'll see, or you can sign your deportation proceedings and we'll auto-deport you within a few weeks. Right? And so the way in which representation is obtained if you are an asylum seeker in the United States is either you can pay for it, so you can hire a private lawyer, and on average, I would say, a good defense would probably cost somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000 if you're to hire a private lawyer. Or you find an NGO that's willing to help support you, or you go it alone. And the vast majority of people that go it alone lose. Location matters as well. If you commit a crime in San Francisco, or you commit a crime in New York, or you commit a crime in Durango, the expectation is that Lady Justice does her thing, and the evidence is weighed, and the decision is made. But when it comes to asylum cases, that's not how it works. Asylum cases vary in terms of decisions vastly based on where the judges are located. So in more liberal states like California, more people gain asylum. In more conservative states like Texas, fewer people gain asylum. And so in a sense, it's not neutral at all, right? The decisions are oftentimes based on political norms and where people live much more than the evidence of a case. Now, this won't come to as a surprise to you, but one of the last things you could imagine people doing if they were fleeing for their life is stopping to gather the evidence that you might need to demonstrate once you get to the United States that your life was actually in jeopardy. And so oftentimes evidence is a barrier, right? People don't have the evidence that they need, or they can't get it quick enough, right? By working with people back home to get them death certificates and news clippings and pictures, et cetera, to meet the needs of a trial. And then finally, country matters a great deal. Where you're from is one of the biggest determinants of whether or not you get asylum. And so if we look at some of the numbers, Afghanistan, for example, in recent years has been among those with the highest approval rates. And so about 88%. This is without considering 2025, last shifted last year. All of these numbers have dropped since then. Venezuela, Nicaragua, Mexico. Mexico's actually tied second to last. Despite we opened with a description of some of the work that I did in Mexico last fall, and you saw some of the photos from the groups that I was walking with and the women that I was talking with to learn more about the types of threats that people face that lead them to pursue asylum in the United States. And despite the harrowing reality of Mexico currently, it's tied for second to last in terms of approval rates for asylum. In fact, it's just well known within immigration lawyer circuits. If you're from Mexico, it's really not worth your time to apply for asylum. Most people just don't apply at all. Overall, 61% of asylum cases end in deportation proceedings, and that, again, is without considering data from 2025. Those numbers have dropped in the last year. And if we look at this, I think coming back to kind of where we started the talk, I think it reflects the fact that our political values are currently getting in the way of something that traditionally has been a norm within the United States. That is, providing haven for those that are in need of it. These are images from Guanajuato from last fall. The search parties, the images on the top left are of a young man with a pick searching in a field outside of León, Guanajuato. These other two images that you see on diagonal are images from August 30th of last year, which is the International Day of Disappeared People. The collectives of women that I was working with came together in the main plaza and printed out photos of their missing loved ones to draw attention to the issue. And then here you have a picture from Irapuato, which is a small town in Guanajuato. Well, it's a city in Guanajuato, about 45 minutes from León. And while I was in Mexico last year, there were 32 bodies found in this particular site. Mass graves are unfortunately common. I read an article this morning in the local newspaper from Guanajuato. Guanajuato was, last year, more bodies were found in mass graves in Guanajuato than anywhere else in the nation. I want to, as I wrap or kind of round into the end of the talk, I want to share a story with you. A story that's connected to our local community. This is about an individual who I'll simply refer to as Senora Torres, even though that's not her name. But it is about a real person. For obvious reasons, I'll keep her name. I won't reveal her name. She's from Guanajuato. Several years ago, her grandfather happened to luckily not be home. But there was a series of people working on his home. And the people that were there was over 6 albañiles, as they're referred to in Mexico, but workers. Armed men showed up and they massacred all of them on top of the roof. They thought they were family members of the individual's grandfather. Shortly thereafter, a brother and uncle were kidnapped, never to be seen again. And her parents and family members were threatened by armed individuals. Guanajuato, this individual happens to be from a part of Guanajuato that's run by a cartel called Santa Lima de Rosa. And Santa Lima de Rosa runs or traffics petrol. So they traffic huachicol, or basically gasoline that's been stolen, right? They refer to it as ordeñando la vaca, or basically taking out the milk, right? And so what they do, because there's a refinery in Guanajuato, is they locate the refinery's ducts, and then when there's no oil in the system, of course they work with someone on the inside that's on the take, they tap into the duct and they put a valve on it, and then when the oil is coming through, they simply open the valve and steal the oil, right? And then they force people through threats, owners of gas stations, to buy the stolen petrol, right? So huachicol is big business in parts of Guanajuato. And Santa Lima de Rosa runs it, but the fact is that Guanajuato is right next to Jalisco, and Jalisco's run by a different cartel. The Cartel de Cuatro Letras, or the four-letter cartel, or it's Jalisco Nueva Generación is the name of the cartel. And so those two cartels have basically been warring for the last several years, the last 5 to 6 years, over transport points and over the petrol industry and over illicit drugs and other things that organized criminals apparently care about. And so they happen to be from a region where this conflict is extremely heated, está caliente, as they say, right? And so one of the things that I remember from this case that really stuck with me, and is the reason that I started walking with these women in Guanajuato in the first place, is that Senora Torres said, "We know where my uncle is, but we can't go look for him." And what she meant is, and she was referring to this hill that you see in the background, which is an extinct volcano, is they know that there's clandestine graves on that hill. And they know her uncle is likely up there. But they can't go search for her uncle, because if they do, they run the same risk that he ran, right, of being disappeared. And so people are aware of what's going on, and they've come together in these collectives to respond as a result of authorities doing not doing what they should be doing, right? Now, I want to bring this home, bring it back to where we currently are. I think if there's one original principle in the United States, it's asylum. But asylum's at the heart of everything we do. It's the heart of the experiment. There's been a great deal of travesty and conquest and displacement and all kinds of different things that have happened in the history of the United States. But at the heart of the experiment of democracy is this concept of asylum, right? This idea that if you have been pursued and your life has been at threat, that this is a place where you can find safe haven. And I think that as we look at the images from around the country, both of foreign individuals who have been apprehended, as well as U.S. citizens, like the man you have on the right here was recently apprehended within the last few weeks, who happened to be a U.S. citizen. When ICE broke down his door, he told them he was a U.S. citizen. He asked if they wanted to see his documentation proving he was a U.S. citizen, and they said no, as they slammed it to the floor. And they drove him around the block for a few hours until they realized he was a U.S. citizen. They just dropped him back off, as if nothing had happened. I think as we watch these images and we're witnessing what we're seeing unfold around the nation, what we're witnessing is something more than just a rebuttal against immigration, right? What we're seeing is a breakdown or erosion of a way of life. We're watching the principles of democracy that have been fought for in different time periods in this country unravel. And we're retreating that's been foundational to this country since the beginning, the idea of asylum. Thank you.